Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Andreas Kyriacou. Andreas, pronounce your last name again for us, please.
Kyriacou.
Oh, Kyriacou. Okay, not Kyriacou, it's Kyriacou. All right, so Andreas, I like to study individualism, and you have written on the topic. Individualism is crucial to the success of many societies. It is associated with positive variables like good governance, the governance of commons, economic growth, innovation, trust, etc. So today, Andreas, we'll be talking about individualism and good governance. And in 2015, you produced a paper, and it's still quite relevant, titled Individualism, Collectivism, Governance, and Economic Development. Andreas, what is good governance and why is it important?
Okay, first of all, Lipton, thanks very much for the invitation. Well, let me try and explain this in the most simple way possible. Good governance basically is impartial governance. So it means that public administrators or people with public authority, they exercise this authority impartially. They don't use their personal preferences when they make decisions, right? So, for example, that means that things that would violate impartiality and therefore represent bad governance would be things like corruption. No, corruption is employing public resources for your own benefit, so that's benefiting yourself or for those benefiting others. That would be a violation of impartiality. Staffing the public administration with relatives or people that you know, that would be a violation of impartiality, and that you get inefficient public administrations from that. And obviously, impartiality also implies the rule of law, right? Which means that you treat everybody equally, independently of their status, social or economic, in a sense. So that's probably the most effective way to define good governance. Although the World Bank, has like more a more extensive definition, which includes other things. But I would say that even these other dimensions that the World Bank introduces, they can all be boiled down to this impartial use of public authority. Okay.
And good governance enables talented bureaucracies to flourish, because if you're impartial, you're going to select competent people to serve.
Exactly. So this is like one of the things that are antithetical with this good governance would be like clientelism, for example, right? So whereby you staff the public administration with people in exchange for their vote. No, that would be something that would violate impartiality, and of course, merit is not the issue. It's not the criterion for hiring the people. It's personal connections or electoral benefit, right? So there's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to get an efficient public administration if that's the criterion.
Yes, right? and as you said, clientelism is the opposite of good governance.
Yes.
All right.
Definitely.
Professor Andrew, okay, you may go ahead.
Yeah, because the idea of clientelism, right? It's this concept is the idea of people giving their vote to politicians, which are competing for office in a sense, in exchange for private benefits, right? So it could be cash, it could be material benefits, it could be jobs in the public administration, it could be interventions on your behalf before the bureaucracy or access to public services, things like that, right? So yeah, it's a phenomenon that's it's obviously characteristic of badly governed countries. No? So clientelism, you would expect clientelism not to have a bad effect on the quality of governance, in a sense.
And clientelism is more predominant in countries favoring in-group associations, but some economists argue that in-groups can promote development in developing countries. Why is this so?
Well, yeah, I would say that this association between in-groups and development, in my mind at least, is a negative one, right? Because there are reasons why you would expect in-groups to have a negative effect on development, and maybe after that, giving these reasons, maybe we can think about how they can maybe promote development, right? But the reasons are, some of them you mentioned in your introduction, right? So, for example, a strong in-group implies, in some cases, pressures within the group to share your earned income, right? And so there are redistributive pressures within the group, and obviously this reduces your incentive to exert an effort, right? To accumulate income, because you know that the group is going to come and ask for some of this income, no? Another reason why in-groups might undermine development is because of the idea of trust, right? Generalized trust is a factor which affects positively economic development, because basically it means that, you know, if you trust others in economic transactions, it facilitates economic exchange, right? Now, if in-group strength is very high, that means that instead of generalized trust, you have something that's called particularized trust, right? So trust within the group. So that might mean that you might tend to limit your interactions within your economic interactions also within in-groups, right? So that limits the amount of exchange that you can have in society, right? And that it can make it poorer. And of course, in-groups also, this idea that you have to favor members of your group also can undermine good governance, right? So if you're a public administrator, you might have to, you have like pressure in a sense to favor people from your in-group. So that's again, staffing the administration in the wrong way, maybe corruption, not applying the law in an equal way. So again, it undermines governance, and that by extension can also undermine development, right? The idea that in-groups can foment economic development, I think that's a bit more difficult to argue, right? So the logic of the in-group is a logic of insurance, right? So you can also, within the in-group, you can have some insurance when you're faced with uncertainty, right? And of course, in poorer countries, uncertainty or existential uncertainty can be higher, right? So it makes sense also to look towards groups which are, or people that are loyal to you, so they can help you out in a sense, now in this situation. So it can have like an economic logic at the micro level, but the problem is that at the macro level, and compared to countries where the in-group pressures are weaker, it tends to hinder development.
Yes. And on page 7 in your article, you list some countries with high levels of governance: Finland, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, while government quality is especially low in countries like Iraq, Sierra Leone, and Bangladesh.
Yes.
And you also compared Australia to Angola. So Australia is more individualistic than Angola. And as most of us do know, Australia is also known for corporate governance and institutional quality.
Yes. Yeah, that's the example of Australia and Angola was basically because the data that was used in that article, the author, which is Gerd Hofstede, of the original data, where he describes these countries, and it's a very easy way to appreciate what individualism is, right? Individualism is the idea that people are autonomous. The links between people, they have links within their nuclear family, but not too strong links outside that. Merit is very important. Independence is important. Success, achievement is important at the individual level, right? And on the other hand, collectivist societies are, societies with strong in-groups where cohesion is more important, loyalty is more important, sharing is important, right? So the way that, if you think about it, individual societies are like incentive compatible, if you like, with economic development, right? Because it's this idea of innovation and getting ahead, being entrepreneurial. It's not that there are not entrepreneurial people in collectivist countries, but the incentives there to this type of activity are different, right? And what I did in this article that you mentioned was that to say that, okay, individualism and collectivism, which is two sides of the same coin, well, they can have an impact on economic development. That's true, but they can also have an impact on governance, right? And since a lot of people have related governance, good governance with economic development, my question was whether the impact of individualism and collectivism on economic development passed through governance, right? So the idea, again, going back to the definition of individualism, in a country where people are independent, autonomous, merit is important, you would expect to have, efficient public administrations, recruiting people and promoting people on the basis of merit. You would expect to have more rule of law, right? The application of law equally to all individuals because of the importance of the individual in these societies. So these are the basic elements of good governance, right? And in fact, what comes out in that article, at least empirically, is that insofar as individualism and collectivism do impact on economic development, they do so largely because of their effect on governance quality, right? So individualistic societies, the ones that you mentioned, for example, Finland, Holland, etc. Well, they are rich in part because this individualism underscores or supports a better governance structure, and this contributes towards, it gives the right incentives for people to contribute towards economic growth, right? We didn't say this before, but good governance is impartial governance, and in terms of economic development, it translates towards protected property rights. It translates towards efficiently provided public services, including health and education services. So if you think about it, a country with well-protected property rights and with equality of opportunity, in the sense that most people can develop their competencies, right? Because there are public health and education services. Well, that's a good foundation on which to build development, right? So that's why governance seems to be so important for economic development.
But contrary to what some people may surmise, collectivism can also promote growth insofar as it facilitates the coordination of production factors and collective action more generally. Explain.
Yeah, that's the idea that, well, yes, the fact that within a collectivist society, there is more homogeneity, right? And then, with respect to the different members, it's easier for people to coordinate among themselves because there's more cohesion, right, within the group, right? And this cohesion, well, it can be good for production processes, but especially for production processes that don't depend so much on innovation and new technologies, right? So in a sense, individualism is much closer related to the introduction of new technologies and innovation, right? But within a given production process or with a given technology, the fact that the group is cohesive, so there's collectivism, can generate also benefits, right? The thing is, what is more important for growth? Cohesion within a given technology or the introduction of new technologies, okay? And at least in economics, we put a lot of emphasis on innovation as a contributor to long-term growth. So even though collectivism can have some positive effects on the capacity to produce, it has a negative effect on more long-term dynamic factors like innovation and technology, which are, I would say, more important for development in the long run.
And you elaborate as such. Conversely, individualism can hamper growth insofar as it undermines social coordination, while collectivism can do so to the extent that it imposes conformism, thus blunting individual initiative. Consistent
Exactly.
with this, their empirical analysis reveals a stronger positive effect of individualism on output per worker, productivity, and innovation. So the gains of individualism are greater than the gains of collectivism. It appears that collectivism has an optimal level.
Exactly. So yeah, both of them can have a contribution, but individualism's contribution towards economic development is potentially stronger. And so the fact that they are the two sides of the same coin, in a sense, you cannot have one and the other, right? So you can either have one or the other, in a sense, right? So that's why we expect individualism to have a bigger impact on economic development. Again, to reiterate, it's this thing about it's related to more to innovation and the introduction of new technologies and ideas, right? Which is more compatible with an individualist culture. But again, there is evidence which points towards the impact of individualism on economic development, also innovation, etc. But what I did in that paper was to introduce the concept of governance, right? So, and as I said, because governance is typically expected to have a positive contribution, good governance, a positive contribution to development, for the reasons that I stated, well-protected property rights, equality of opportunity, creating, a large population with competent population with an incentive to invest, in a sense. If individualism has a positive impact on good governance, then it can also have an impact from there on to development. That's what I find in that paper.
Explain the causal mechanism. Is it that, well, we already established this point that individualistic cultures promote good governance, but do countries become more individualistic after accumulating wealth? Because as you write, individualism is conducive towards higher government quality, but good governance may also contribute towards a more individualistic culture.
Yes, I mean, there are two things there. One of them you mentioned is, one of the drivers. So an interesting question is, what drives individualism, right? So what does it depend upon? I think that one important driver of individualism is economic development, because that's known as the modernization hypothesis. That's the idea that, you can think of it in the opposite way. So as countries develop, collectivism or the strength of the in-group it becomes weaker. Okay, and what's the reason here? Well, it's the idea that if you are a poor country, then you have a stronger scarcity constraint, right? As an individual, you face more scarcity. In the context of scarcity, that means you experience uncertainty, right? In a poor country. This greater uncertainty than you would in a wealthier country, right? So this uncertainty, this existential uncertainty, drives you, makes it optimal for you to seek the comfort of the group, in a sense, okay? Because as I said, the group can be like an insurance mechanism, okay? So that means that individualism will be weaker in poorer countries, right? Now, as countries develop, as they become wealthier, the scarcity constraint is relaxed, and so also uncertainty falls. So the logic of group identification is weakened, And that allows individualism to flourish. Okay, so that's why we see that there's a very tight relationship between development, the level of economic development, and individualism across countries. Okay, that's one reason, right? So development can promote individualism. The other thing that you said about governance quality, well, yeah, I mean, this is like it's like a circular argument, so it's difficult to disentangle which comes first. I mean, I like to think of these things as virtuous or vicious cycles, right? So it can be a virtuous cycle. So if for some reason you can have governance quality, for some exogenous reason you have a good governance, obviously this, which means, remember, it means impartiality in the exercise of public authority. It means that you can get ahead on your merits. You don't have to bribe just in the courts. You don't have to use your influence. So in this type of environments also, where there's good governance, it's less necessary for you to be a member of a group, right? Because you don't need the protection of the group. You don't need it so much in very good governance settings. So again, you would expect that good governance would tend to reduce in-group loyalty, and it also would therefore be associated with the flourishing of individualism. Okay, but that's like a theoretical argument. The question is, and I'm not really aware about any particular research on this. It's easier to talk about individualism affecting governance because individualism is like a cultural aspect, which is very slow changing. It's more difficult to talk about good governance affecting individualism because it's very much more difficult to see evidence on this. Okay, because governance, well, as I said, it's difficult to get good governance in collectivist countries, right? So you need this counterexample, right? You need an example where you have good governance in a collectivist setting, and over time you would have to observe, the reduction of in-group loyalty. So that's more difficult to observe.
There's a statement in your article that should be explained for our listeners. Second, I find that the positive impact of individualism on economic development disappears in the presence of government quality. What do you mean?
Yeah, this is an empirical statement, right? So when you estimate the impact of individualism on economic development, you find that it has a positive association, right? So more individualism implies more development. But when you control for governance quality, so you add governance quality as an explanatory variable, if you like, an additional variable, the effect of individualism, right, on economic development disappears. So the governance quality is what is basically explaining development, right? And since we know that individualism, or we hypothesize that individualism has a positive effect on governance quality, then so we can suggest that if individualism is contributing to development, it's because it's improving governance in a sense, right? And not so much because of other channels. Okay, so it's like an indirect channel. Individualism does not directly, at least in this empirical study, individualism does not directly affect economic development. Its effect is indirect. It passes through governance quality.
All right. So Andreas,
okay.
In 2019, you published a book, Inequality and Governance. You can go ahead and share the key points with us.
Well, yeah, in that book, if you like, it's a bit of an extension of the ideas that came out of that paper, because basically what I wanted to do in that book is to explore the determinants of good governance, as we defined it as impartial governance. And since inequality has been rising across the world over the last 40 years, well, And there was some evidence that inequality, was harmful to good governance. I wanted to explore this more fully, right? So in that book, I start off basically beyond defining the basic concepts. What I do is I identify what I call long-term determinants of in-group favoritism, and also another thing that we have not talked about, which is hierarchically structured social relationships. So when I was talking about before about poor countries and in-group favoritism, well, you also tend to see that in poor countries, relationships are hierarchically structured, right? So it's typically, not always, but it's typically a combination that you have strong in-groups and hierarchical social relationships, okay? And on the other hand, in rich countries, in many rich countries, you have weak in-groups, so more individualism and more egalitarian relationships, right? So what I do in the first part of the book is try to I ask myself, why is it that some countries have this type of, if you like, cultural dimensions, right? Strong groups, hierarchy versus individualism and egalitarianism, and in line with a lot of the literature, which is trying to detect long-term determinants of current outcomes. I identify a set of factors, right? I'm not going to go into them because we don't have time, but things like pathogens is a factor. The size of the society is a factor. Conflict in the past is a factor, and also the way that food was typically procured in the pre-industrial era, right? So these are four factors that vary across societies, and therefore they lead to different mixes of in-group bias and the hierarchy, right? And so at the end of the day, well, you can imagine that a society where individualism is important, as I said before, but also relationships are more egalitarian, is more likely to be a society where you have the rule of law, where you have impartiality in general, right? So that's the one that's contributing towards development, and the other societies are the ones where we have in-group bias and hierarchy. This is more like clientelistic relationships, public decisions that favor in-group members, which is antithetical, as we said, to economic development. So that's what I do in the first part of the book, and then I empirically also investigate the combination, the relationship between inequality, economic inequality, these cultural traits, which is individualism and hierarchy, and how they impact on governance. And a lot of interesting results emerge, but that would be a whole other interview to get into those.
Yes. Andreas, would you say that income inequality adversely affects governance via the channel of hierarchy?
Yes, I mean, income inequality can affect governance more or less directly, or can adversely affect governance directly, because there are two arguments here. One is that people on the wealthy end of the income distribution, the economic elites, they can capture public authority for their benefit, right? But also people on the other end of the income distribution, the ones that are relatively poor, well, they might, because they face scarcity and they face a lot of constraints, well, they might be willing to enter into clientelistic relationships, bribe, to get access to public resources, right? So there's like a society which is very unequal has these two extremes, which are feeding on good governance and undermining it. Okay, but then what you're asking is if there is an indirect channel. So apart from this effect on governance from economic inequality, you can also get inequality in a sense, within the context of collectivism, right? So inequality is something that it's a vicious cycle, right? The more inequality you have, the more sense it makes that you are part of a group, right? And the more likely it is that you will be faced with asymmetric social relationships, right? And the more the stronger the groups and the more asymmetrical relationships, also the more likely that you're going to get inequality. So yeah, inequality can promote group favoritism and also social hierarchies, and from there you can get a negative effect on governance. Okay, so yeah, it's all it's related, and that's what I deal with, this interaction between economic inequality, culture measured in terms of individualism or collectivism on the one hand and hierarchy on the other, and governance is the subject of the 5th chapter in that book. Yes.
All right. So Professor Andreas, thanks a lot for appearing on the show. Speaking to you has been awesome, but unfortunately, I have to go. So bye. And your book, Andreas, I would love to read your book. We'll continue this conversation via email.
Thank you very much, Lipton.
All right. Bye. Yes.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.